Welcome to Module 5 of EDD 918. And in this module, as you can tell from the title, we are going to be looking at power and influence in organizations. And hopefully you have the slides there in front of you. And in this first lecture, I basically just want to go over the definition of power and a little bit about how it works in an organization. And then the next two will dive further into the types of power and then influence. So with power, you'll notice that first slide I put power, it's not a bad word. It's more than 4 letters, just kind of joking around there. But I say that because I think for a lot of people, power does have a negative connotation. You're trying to get power over me or things like that. And so there's just kind of a negative connotation in that. I think some of that is rightfully it's deserved, right? We've seen a lot of abuses of power in a multitude of organizations, whether that's government, for-profit, non-profit, religious, faith-based, right? We've seen people in positions of power abuse that power in a wide variety of ways. And so understandably, we can get that negative feeling. But what I want us to see through this module is power is not a bad thing. There's nothing in my mind wrong or negative about allowing someone to have power over me. And I'll give you some examples as we go along. And ultimately, power and influence, that's how we get stuff done in organizations. It is through those dual aspects of power and influence. That's how the work really is accomplished. And I hope you'll see that as we go through this lecture. So then, as we look at the slides, now that first point there on the definition slide, I said English is boring. And I just say that because, well, it is from the standpoint of we use a lot, in English we use a lot of the same words for different things, and that can get confusing, right? The word love is always a classic example. I love chocolate cake, and I love my wife. Don't love them the same way, right? And so that's what I mean. And power is that way. So when we say power, we could be talking about the power that's running my computer, the power that's running your computer, right? Or we could be talking about physical strength and power. We could be talking about military power for countries, or we could be talking about socialized power. So what we're talking about in the context of organizations is what is known as socialized power. And that's what those two definitions are there on the slide. The one is from Pfeffer, Jeff Pfeffer. He is kind of, or was, the go-to guru on organizational power and influence processes. A prolific researcher, scholar, writer, consultant, professor in the field. So he is a go-to guy on this, and so you'll see his definition. Power is a resource, a reservoir of force. Again, don't be alarmed by that term force. It's a resource that can be used by an agent to change the behavior of another. That's what power is. It is me using this reservoir of force that I can get somebody to do something, to change their behavior. We'll say more about that in a second. And then you'll see from our textbook, Robbins and Judge, so person A has the capacity to influence the behavior of B, the other person, so that B acts in accordance with A's wishes. And again, A and B can get a little confusing, but basically it's the idea of I have the ability to influence your behavior so that you do something in accordance with my wishes. Now, I think here's where we can sometimes get into a little bit of a sticking point with the concepts of power and influence. And it's this, even by me reading that definition from Pfeffer or even from Robbins and Judge, I want you to do something in accordance with my wishes, or I want you to change your behavior. I can get you to change your behavior. That sounds manipulative. That sounds like, oh, you're trying to get me to do something that you want me to do. Well, that does not necessarily mean in the organizational setting that what I want to get you the thing I want you to do, that doesn't mean it's like bad or negative or not something that you would want to do. The definition of influence, part of the definition of influence, and we'll get into this a little bit later, is me getting you to do something you hadn't already thought of doing. So again, it's not necessarily getting you to do something illegal, unethical, immoral, against your moral code, your standards, or that would bring you harm. That's a different, I just call that manipulation. And it's a kind of a subset of power and influence. That's not what we're talking about. We're just straight up saying you may not have thought of, you get hired to do a job, you don't know all of the tasks you need to do. And so I come along and say, hey, here's your job description and here's your task I need you to accomplish. Okay, that's power. That's influence. You say, no, that's just doing my job. Right, because I'm your boss. And so I said, here's what I need you to do. Had you thought of doing that? No. Why? Because you didn't know what you needed to do. You just didn't have the task list. So that's what power and influence is, that easy. And again, I think we sometimes try and blow it up. Now, it can be more complicated. There's negative aspects of it for sure. We'll talk about that a little bit as we go along, but I just want to make sure that we're clear on that. And so then the next slide you'll see there is called dependence. And it's pretty important to note that the concepts of power and influence are built on dependence. So the more person B is dependent on person A, the greater the power that that person exerts over them. Let's use in the home for right now. With your kids, depending on the age of your kids, you have more power over them, right? Now, my hope is you have a good, loving relationship if you have kids at home and there's respect being built, things like that. But the reality is, so I have basically 3 grown kids. My youngest is a senior in high school. My son, who's 20, still lives at home with us. He works at a bank and is determining his next step in life. He's basically independent. And then I have 2 who are married and out of the house. Do they ask me for advice? Yes. Do I have some influence over them? Sure. And we're going to get into different kinds of power. But I can't tell them that they have to be in their home by a certain time. Why? Well, I don't have that control over them. I don't pay their bills. I don't buy their food. There's no kind of dependence like that. My senior in high school, I still can. I can still say, hey, you're going to be out with friends, but I need you home by a certain time. And she needs to respect that, right? And if not, we can have a conversation about loss of privileges or things. Why? Because she's dependent on me for most of her stuff. So that's what we're talking about. So the more they're dependent, then the more power a person exerts over them. So that's where the concept of dependence comes in. And by the way, I want to make sure that this is clear. Because again, sometimes when we talk about power and influence in an organization, we can feel like, so the boss has all of the power in the relationship. No, they don't. Not by a long shot. Just to use the old terms, the employee, often they have a great deal of power. Why? Because the boss is dependent upon the employee. Because the boss needs the employee to do the work to get it done. And especially when we're dealing with more of the knowledge worker, there's a lot of expertise here. And I don't want to lose that expertise. So there's a lot of power there, which is why, just to kind of bring it to a base level, employees can go in and negotiate for a pay raise or increased salary and things like that. Not that it's all about the money, but that's just a simple, ready example, right? So again, you get the idea, dependence. Dependence is key. And so again, the next slide kind of breaks that out. So, but here's what it has to be. Now you have to, I'll just use me, A has to have resources or access or control over resources, however you want to phrase that kind of meet these 3 criteria. One, that it's actually important to subject matter B, to the other person. If it's not important to you, it doesn't do any good. I can just use a very silly example. If I tell you all as doctoral students, hey, I need you to get your assignments in on time, and if you do, I'm going to put a sticker on your paper. I know it's all digital, but you know what I mean, right? Okay, stickers aren't real motivating to doctoral students, whereas kindergartners, ooh, yeah, they love those stickers, right? So it has to be important. Secondly, it has to be relatively scarce, something that isn't easy to come by. And so, again, if there's just an abundance of this thing, and I say, hey, I'll let you get a drink of water if you do your work, not real motivating, right? And then the last thing is kind of connected to that B cannot obtain without me, or easily replaced. So again, paycheck, things like that. Now, this is where we get into this in organizations. If A is the boss, B is the employee, and B comes in and says, hey, I want a pay raise, and A says, nope, not giving you a pay raise, B already has another job lined up, and they say, okay, I'm leaving. Here's my 2 weeks notice. And A says, well, wait a minute, you can't go. Well, yeah, I can. I already got another job lined up. So you don't really have power over me. I have all of the power in this situation. So that's kind of how that process works. And so again, I'm going to end this lecture just by reminding us we're talking here about social power, not to be confused with even like physical strength, physical power, not electrical power, obviously. And I put a question on there, or I put a statement on there, and this is the discussion. So I have the first discussion for this module right after this lecture. My professor in my doctoral program took a class called Power and Influence. We spent a whole semester covering power and influence. Whew, did we do a deep dive? Anyway, Jay Barbuto is the guy's name, and he made this statement. And we actually, I think, spent an entire 3 hour, because we meet on Wednesday nights for 3 hours. I think we may have spent an entire 3 hour class discussing this and hashing through this. That's kind of the fun of doctoral programs, right? But he made this statement: no one has power over you unless you give it to them. No one has power over you unless you give it to them. And then I put on the slide, agree, disagree. And that's the subject of the discussion, this first discussion for this module. I want you to think about that statement, think about organizations, jump in, do you agree, disagree, and is it necessarily a bad thing? So just kind of wage in there, think about that, wrestle around with it. I won't give you, I don't know if I put in the discussion kind of my opinion. My opinion on this has shifted and changed over the years a little bit. But anyway, it's a fun topic. It's meant to be fun, but also to challenge our thinking a little bit on this subject of power, of social power. So looking forward to engaging in the discussion with you, and then we'll see you in the next lecture.